well-known, renowned expert in laser-driven fusion, both direct drive and indirect drive, and is involved in many of the organisation and committees involved in the future of ICF, particularly as chair of the UK Inertial Fusion Consortium.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Today I'm going to talk about various things. I'm just going to give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. So what is laser inertial fusion? I wasn't sure who I was talking to today in terms of knowledge and how much detail I should go in, so I've taken a relatively top-level perspective on things. Then there's direct drive versus indirect drive. Ongoing laser fusion experiments on international facilities, so that's really focused on things that I'm particularly leading. And then there's the thought of why use inertial fusion from the point of view of power production, and then some thoughts and comments on physics and facility requirements for inertial fusion. So I'd like to thank my collaborators, in particular those at the University of York, Laboratory for Laser Energetics, and Lawrence Livermore. So, laser inertial fusion. So laser inertial fusion starts with an extremely spherical capsule, like you can see here in the center. So at the center, inside, there is a fuel layer. It's a hollow shell. That's then illuminated from all different directions by laser beams. This is the direct drive scheme I'm going to talk about for now. And so why do we do this? The goal is to heat up the outside layer of the capsule, which then expands radially outwards, and then that radial outward expansion through conservation of momentum creates an equal and opposite inward force, which then drives the implosion inwards. And what this does is it causes the inside to get very hot and dense. So if we zoom in on that, so we have this dense blob in the center. So what's happened is the volume of this blob of DT plasma has reduced massively because you have the effect of spherical convergence. The volume is proportional to radius cubed, and so as a consequence the gas gets to very high pressure, and so you have this shell which is coming in. It's got lots of kinetic energy given to it by the lasers and the ablative process, and the pressure on the inside starts pushing outwards on the shell and decelerates it, and in doing so it converts the kinetic energy of the shell into internal energy in the hotspot. So that's basically saying you have internal energy is essentially temperature and compressive energy, okay? So that then presses out on the shell, extracts all the energy as long as it remains spherical. And then, so now it's got very hot, very dense, essentially the same conditions as the central sun, so fusion reactions start. The fusion reactions create alpha particles and neutrons. The alpha particles, which is shown here by the green arrows, as long as this hot region is hot enough and dense enough and big enough, the alpha particles will stop within the hot spot and further heat it. Further heating enhances the fusion reactions, more alpha particles are produced, and hopefully it goes pop and releases lots of energy. And then for power production, you essentially repeat that process over and over very rapidly. So the National Ignition Facility, also known as NIF, leads inertial fusion research using laser fusion process. This is an illustration of how it works. I will talk a bit about the NIF process in just a second. But so NIF has the highest fusion energy gain of any fusion facility. Energy gain is defined as fusion energy out divided by energy in. It has a fusion yield of approximately 4.9 e to the 17 neutrons. That's about 1.37 megajoules. And I mean, this is a controversial statement potentially, but I would say that fusion energy is anticipated within the next 3 years. There's various energy upgrades and improvements in the implosion capsule quality and things like that are ongoing. So you'll note in this picture that the beams aren't going directly on the capsule, so the capsule is this bright blob in the middle. This is because NIF uses what's called the indirect drive approach to laser inertial fusion. So the beams actually illuminate the whole ram, this gold can, which then re-emits X-rays. And the goal of that is to drive the implosion extremely uniformly. And NIF actually uses 192 laser beams on target to help do that. So NIF ignition has demonstrated the key inertial fusion physics. So on the left here you can see the NIF indirect drive experimental platform. This has 1.9 megajoules of laser energy in. Of that 1.9 megajoules, about 0.23 megajoules absorbed as X-rays by the capsule, and then it emits 1.35 megajoules of fusion energy. Okay, so this is the first demonstration of thermonuclear ignition in the laboratory, as recently published, which is a great result for the field. It has a fusion energy of gain 0.72, so it hasn't actually created more energy out than what we put in. But if you think about how much has been absorbed by the implosion, it's actually putting out 5 times more than was actually absorbed. And then if you look at how much has gone into the fuel itself, it's actually 45 times more. Of course, neither of these latter two considerations are important from the point of view of power production, but they're interesting from the point of view of physics and showing that the burning physics really works. The disadvantage of indirect drive is it's very inefficient, so only 12% of the X-rays created are actually absorbed by the capsule, and it's complex and uses expensive targets. And finally, because the whole RAM is made of gold or uranium, you get material activation. And all of these make IFE more challenging. So what I principally concentrate in is what's called direct drive, which is what I described before, where the laser beams are directly incident on the capsule. This has the same proven capsule physics. The laser plasma interaction around the edge is slightly different, but the nice thing is it has 4 times higher efficiency. You have smaller, so you can potentially have a smaller, cheaper laser. And you can use more simple targets, which are amenable to economic mass manufacturing, and has a high fusion energy gain, so good power plant economics. But there are some physics uncertainties which remain. So, I'm also, why have we got this here? So, I was asked to talk about work that I am doing. So, there's this new shock augmented ignition laser fusion concept. So, these are experiments that are ongoing on NIF and Omega. So, So the central hotspot ignition, which is shown up, which is what I've just described, this is great because it's proven. It's been used on NIF and Omega, but the yield is limited by fluid instability. So this is sort of illustrated here, where you get these non-uniformities in the implosion which happen. And so that limits how fast your implosion can go, and hence what yield you can get. There's this other proposed idea called shock ignition, which is really nice because you can reduce the implosion velocity, decreasing your susceptibility to fluid instabilities, but it has other limitations due to the required laser intensity. So what I've been working on recently with others who are here is this idea of shock augmented ignition. And the idea of this is to essentially launch a strong shock, like in shock ignition, but without the very high peak intensities required in the original shock ignition proposal. So you can see an illustration here. So the conventional implosion power versus time is showing in black there, whereas the shock augmented ignition is this red line. So you have this dip in power and then a rise. And what the dip does is it sort of it changes the plasma conditions in ways that I don't have time to go into, in order that it makes it easier to launch the shock. And hence you can, in principle, realize the benefits of shock ignition and central hotspot ignition. So you can have lower implosion velocity, high laser coupling, and low preheat like central hotspot ignition. This has been published recently. So we had an experiment to test this on Omega a couple of years ago now. We used the Omega laser, which had 60 beams on target, 23 kilojoules of UV laser light. You can see the sort of laser pulse versus time. So there's various different features. So you send shocks in and other shocks to compress the capsule slowly, then you accelerate it up, and then the final spike at the end launches the shock. And this is the sort of targets we use. They're extremely spherical, very perfect. This was a gas-filled implosion, so had deuterium gas fill. And then we had loads of diagnostics, I think probably about 25 diagnostics in total, using 4D hotspot tomography, imaging of the implosion trajectory, areal density measurements. And so what we saw, what we were looking at was to try and investigate the optimal shock launching time. So we started out with one pulse shape here, which has the shock launched at a certain time, and we got a certain yield and certain ion temperature. We then moved the shock launching time slightly later. We had an increase in yield, increase in ion temperature, then moved it later still, and it really dropped off. And what we observed was about a 2 times increase in yield to about just under 2 × 10 neutrons, peak in ion temperature, and positive initial results. And we have another experiment with Nigel next year to look at this. So then there's also an indirect drive version of this, which is ongoing on NIF. The idea of this, so this NIF's record shot is this N210808. We have this, which is shown by the green line here. And then what we've done is we've taken this design, taken exactly the same capsule design, the same laser energy, and just added this dip and then rise in order to create the shock augmented ignition sort of concept. And you can see this is the yield from the NIF's record shot reproduced by the simulations. You can see that down here. And then by varying the dip duration and the dip start time, we can get substantial increases in the fusion yield up to about 7 megajoules. So I just skip ahead a bit. So yeah, the idea is to increase yield and increase robustness to hydrodynamic instabilities. So the questions we've been wondering about experimentally is can you create this dip in radiation temperature as a function of time, and can we keep the implosion round with a longer pulse shape? So we had an experiment on the 25th of October to look at this. So you can see the very complex laser pulse shape, which now has this great big dip in it. Normal NIF pulse shapes would just come straight across here and then finish, whereas this is essentially completely different. So then we looked at the radiation temperature as a function of time. So, sorry, on the laser pulse shape, I should have said the blue is what we asked for and the dashed blue is what we got. So you can see it's incredibly accurate. And then with the red lines, the solid red is what we wanted, and the dashed red is what we got. So it was really it was a nice result. And we've got other experiments coming up in January and April next year. So, moving on to potential advantages of inertial fusion energy. So if we look at magnetic fusion tokamak, my concern personally, maybe Ian would disagree, is that the complex technology is adjacent to the harsh fusion plasma and surrounds it kind of like a Russian doll. So you can see you have the superconducting magnets here and then the plasma right next to it. And so my worry is that, if you have all these neutrons being produced, does your tokamak get damaged, and can you maintain it, and this sort of thing. Whereas with laser fusion, I think this is equally applicable to first light fusion's concept. You have the ability to separate your complex technology from the harsh fusion environment. So laser beams can be focused from very far away. The targets. So the lasers are very complex, but they're physically separated. The targets have to be very perfect, but they're injected just before they're shot with a laser. So in principle, you can create this separation of the critical infrastructure from the harsh plasma, reduce neutron damage, and potentially simplify reactor maintenance. So you can see the NIF chamber here is this massive sphere, and you imagine you've got a tiny target at the center of that, which is the size of a peppercorn. So you have this big physical separation between the two. The other thing about, it's talking specifically about laser fusion, but again, I think it's equally applicable to First Light's work, is the fact that there's a degree of modularity to the technology. So you have the driver, the targets, target injection and chamber, and these can all be potentially developed rapidly in parallel. There's other aspects, reduced tritium inventory, which was mentioned earlier, roughly a tenth for ICF concept, and possibly reduced capital expenditure. So, briefly, requirements for IFE drivers. So there's physics requirements, and I'm just going to have one slide on systems requirements due to time considerations. So this is a schematic of an implosion and all the different things that can go wrong in laser direct drive schemes, which I'm not going to go into in detail. But so there's implosion sphericity. I think the things I'm talking about today should be equally applicable for all ICF schemes, as far as I'm aware. So you have implosion sphericity, hydrodynamic stability. You have the drive pressure, which then translates into your implosion velocity, and then fuel entropy. And when you combine that with the target parameters, you essentially get your target gain. So we'll start by talking about implosion sphericity. So this is just this schematic diagram with X number of laser beams. But you can imagine if we then had more laser beams or changed the positioning of those laser beams, we can make the drive a lot more uniform. It turns out that the drive has to be uniform to within about 1% in order to get these highly spherical implosions that we require. Then there's beam power balance. So you can see the top beam here has got a lower power balance. If that actually occurs on an experiment, that can cause your implosion to become distorted, egg-like, and that reduces the conversion of kinetic energy into internal energy, making the whole system less efficient. And then you have beam timing, and then you have beam positioning with respect to the target. All of these can create a non-spherical implosion. And they also drive facility specifications. So in terms of the M4 research possibilities, I think one of the key questions in my mind is one impact point stroke. You can imagine. So First Light Fusion are proposing to have one impactor driving their implosion. I can see the advantages of it. I worry that it won't be spherical enough, but it'd be an interesting area for potential research. And you can imagine doing experiments on that. Then in terms of hydrodynamic instabilities, these grow from imperfections either in the drive source or in the capsule. So you can see a schematic of that. And this, with laser beams, you get these small scale inhomogeneities, which then drive these fluid instabilities, which can cause the capsule to completely break up or just reduce the yield somewhat. So I just showed that. And with laser direct drive, there's various, and indirect drive, there's various smoothing schemes that reduce this. In terms of M4 research possibilities, looking at macroscale instability growth measurements due to the large scale of the plasma you'd be able to create on M4 could be interesting, and also I suppose issues to do with the impact of the flyer plate with the amplifier and things like this. And also I think an area which people should be thinking about is Z-pinch cylindrical implosions, which has been touched on quite a bit already. So drive pressure, so this is required for high implosion velocity. From memory, fusion yield is proportional velocity to the 8, so it's very important to have high velocity implosions. Laser ablation gets about 100 gigabar-ish pressures. No, megabar, sorry, wrong units. Yeah, 2 minutes, yeah. And then M4 research possibilities. The issue of, this is something I touched on in my question earlier, so we've got impact-driven versus ablatively accelerated implosions, might be an interesting area of research. And then in terms of fuel entropy, think of this in terms of temperature. This must be kept low in order to keep the fuel compressible, and it can be increased by electrons. So in the direct drive scheme, we have laser plasma instabilities which preheat the fuel. Can be caused by X-ray radiation or by very strong shocks. So this is the plot I showed before, but you can see this very complex laser power as a function of time is in order to drive of state studies and warm dense matter studies and various radiation studies. So just a brief slide on system requirements. So obviously capital cost is a big issue. Operational costs, maintenance costs, energy efficiency, all of these must be compatible with viable physics designs. I don't really have time to go into any of these issues today, but I just thought I'd put it up there. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the UK Inertial Fusion Consortium. So this encompasses national labs, one centre for doctoral training, and lots of research in high energy density science and ICF. Facilities, industry, including first light fusion, and the idea of this is to try and bind this all together into to get people talking, to create a common voice. We have roughly 90 members, and to develop strategy. So we've got the UK Inertial Fusion Roadmap, and to facilitate dialogue, which has happened quite a bit with BEIS over the last year or so, and to help international collaborations. And you can see the website there. That's all I've got to say.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question. Fahad, you get the microphone? Please remind us of your affiliation as well.
Hi Robbie, it's Valerie Jimison here from the Fusion Cluster. Can you comment on the reproducibility of the NIF experiments that was reported in Nature a few months ago?
So NIF, after a little bit of a stutter, shall we say, for reasons that are actually now well understood, NIF has now had 3 shots that are over a megajoule. So, I mean, I say by next, probably February, when they get better quality implosion capsules, they think they'll be able to regularly get shots over a megajoule. And they're also having an energy upgrade to 2.2 megajoules by next summer, I think. So, okay.
Nice talk, Robbie. I have 2 questions. What is the maximum hot electron energies you observe in Omega and NIF experiments? And my second question is, you are proposing these experiments on M3. So what will be the effect on the hot electrons? Because these hot electrons can also produce shocks that you need in shock ignition targets.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I wasn't really sort of proposing experiments on M3 or M4. I was just trying to think of, where would there be overlap between the laser fusion research that I do, as opposed to, what you'd be able to do on the future facility. In terms of the I can't tell you the maximum electron energies, but I can tell you the electron temperature from our Omega and NIF experiments in direct drive of the order of sort of 40 to 55 keV, the slope temperature.
Okay, can we thank Robbie? Sorry, just in the interest of time, that we could move on. So can we thank Robbie one more time?